The Solnechnogorsk pumping station, a facility built during the 1980s of the Soviet Union, 65 kilometers from the Kremlin, went offline at 3:47 in the morning on a Monday in May. The fire that consumed 2 of its 4 pressurization modules was not the result of mechanical failure, nor of maintenance negligence. It was the result of a coordinated long-range drone attack in which the weapons traveled more than 600 kilometers through Russian airspace without being intercepted. And when the flames became visible on the traffic cameras along the M11 highway, what was burning was not merely metal and concrete. It was the fiction that energy infrastructure at the heart of European Russia remained untouchable. The number that defines this event is not in the footage of the fire, it is in the flow. The Solnechnogorsk station operated as one of the redistribution nodes in the pipeline system feeding the heating and industrial gas network of Greater Moscow, a metropolitan region of more than 21 million people, the equivalent of the entire population of countries like Romania or Chile, concentrated at a single point of energy consumption. According to preliminary estimates published by monitoring channels including War Monitor and corroborated by analysts at the German Institute DIW, the partial interruption of pumping reduced gas redistribution capacity to the northern ring of the capital by approximately 18% in the first 12 hours following the attack. 18% is not an abstract number. It is the equivalent of cutting supply to entire districts during the window when factories start their shifts and hospitals bring their climate control systems online. And here was the paradox that Kremlin planners had not accounted for. Over more than 2 years of war, Moscow had built its narrative of domestic invulnerability on a specific premise, that Ukrainian attacks struck refineries on the periphery of the system, Krasnodar, Samara, Bashkortostan, but would never reach the arterial nodes feeding the country's political and economic center. Solnechnogorsk was not the periphery, it was the circulatory system. Step back for a moment and take in the full picture. The Ukrainian campaign against Russian energy infrastructure did not begin in May of 2026. It began systematically in early 2024, when the first domestically produced drones with a range exceeding 1,000 kilometers struck the Novoshaktinsk refinery in the Rostov region. Since then, according to research compiled by the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, more than 160 Russian energy installations have been confirmed targets: refineries, fuel depots, electrical substations, and now pumping stations. The pattern revealed a logic that went far beyond immediate tactical damage. Ukraine was not attempting to destroy Russian production capacity, something that would require hundreds of simultaneous strikes and was beyond its operational reach. It was degrading distribution capacity. The equation had changed. The difference between destroying production and degrading distribution is the difference between trying to drain a lake and blocking the pipes that carry water to the faucets. Russia continued extracting oil and gas in volumes close to pre-war levels, roughly 10.5 million barrels per day of crude oil, according to International Energy Agency data from April of 2026. But the capacity to move that product to domestic consumption points and export terminals was being eroded attack after attack. Each destroyed pumping station did not pull barrels out of the ground. It pulled barrels out of the market. And every barrel that failed to reach the market represented revenue that never entered the coffers of state spending. According to estimates from the Swedish Institute SIPRI, more than $140 billion per year to sustain its war machine. The equivalent of the entire GDP of countries like Hungary or Morocco, funneled exclusively into financing military operations. But the true impact of this operation extended far beyond the battlefield numbers. The attack on Solnechnogorsk crossed a line that until then had existed more as a psychological taboo than a military boundary, the line of proximity to Moscow. 65 kilometers. For context, that is less than the distance between downtown São Paulo and Campinas, or between central Lisbon and Setúbal. It is the distance a Moscow resident drives to spend a weekend at a dacha, a country house, on the outskirts of the capital. When a facility at that distance from the Kremlin is struck by a drone that departed from Ukrainian territory, what ruptures is not a gas pipeline. It is the implicit contract between Putin's regime and the Russian urban population. The contract that said, the war is out there, in the steppes of the Donbass and the fields of Zaporizhzhia, not here. And here was the actor that headlines were not mentioning with the frequency the data warranted. China, the largest energy importer on the planet and a growing buyer of Russian gas and oil at discounts reaching 30% below the Brent price, was observing the degradation of Russia's distribution network with a calculation that had nothing to do with geopolitical solidarity. Beijing had signed long-term supply contracts with Moscow, most notably through the Power of Siberia pipeline, which transported around 38 billion cubic meters per year to northeastern China. Each Ukrainian attack damaging pumping infrastructure in European Russia did not directly affect those eastern flows, but it created systemic pressure on Russia's ability to honor all of its commitments simultaneously. And China knew it. In a moment, you will understand why this Chinese calculation changes the nature of the entire energy equation of the conflict. Consider carefully what this number means in practice. The estimated cost of each Ukrainian long-range drone used in this type of operation was approximately $50,000 per unit, according to analysis by the Royal United Services Institute in London. The cost of repairing a pumping station of Solnechnogorsk scale, including the pressurization modules, the electronic control systems, and the operational downtime, was estimated between $80 and $120 million, not counting revenue losses during the outage period. The ratio was 1 to 2,400. For every dollar Ukraine spent on the attack, Russia needed to spend $2,400 to repair the damage. This was not a conventional war of attrition. It was a war of economic asymmetry, in which the side with fewer resources was imposing proportionally devastating costs on the side with more resources. The weapon had turned. The historical analogy that captures this dynamic most precisely is not the London Blitz, where mass bombardment sought to break the will of a civilian population. It is the Allied strategic bombing campaign against the occupied French railway network in 1944, the so-called Transportation Plan. In that operation, the objective was never to destroy the entire French rail infrastructure. It was to selectively degrade the distribution nodes, marshalling yards, railway bridges, junctions, until the system lost the capacity to move troops and supplies at the speed German defenses required. The result was that on the morning of D-Day, the panzer divisions that should have reached the beaches of Normandy within hours took days instead. The analogy to Solnechnogorsk was surgical. There was no need to destroy the entire system. Degrading the right nodes was enough to make the system cease to function as a system. And there was one more layer that had not yet been addressed, and it changes the nature of this analysis entirely. General Valery Gerasimov, chief of the Russian General Staff, a 68-year-old man who built his entire career on the doctrine of hybrid warfare, and who had personally promised Putin, according to a Moscow Times report from March of 2026, that the S-400 and Panzer S-1 air defense systems would guarantee the inviolability of the airspace over Moscow, now faced the physical evidence that his promise had failed. This general is not the emotional protagonist of this analysis. He is the investigative coordinate for what the Russian defense system actually delivered versus what it promised. The fact that a drone with a radar signature smaller than a large bird had traveled 600 kilometers undetected and struck a target 65 kilometers from the capital was not merely a tactical failure. It was the demolition of a sales argument underpinning billions of dollars in Russian arms export contracts with India, Algeria, Turkey, and Egypt. And here is what that layer revealed. Russian air defense system export contracts represented, according to SIPRI, approximately $6 billion per year in revenue for Moscow's military-industrial complex, the country's second largest source of hard currency after hydrocarbons. Every drone attack that penetrated airspace protected by those systems and struck a high-value target was simultaneously a military blow against energy infrastructure and a commercial blow against the credibility of Russian defense products in the international market. India, which had ordered 5 S-400 system units for a total of $5.4 billion, was already signaling, according to the Indian Express, a review of delivery schedules and contractual terms. The paradox had closed. And here is what the Chinese calculation changed. Beijing did not need Russia to collapse. It needed Russia to remain weakened enough to continue depending on the Chinese market as its buyer of last resort. Every Ukrainian attack on Russian distribution infrastructure pushed Moscow 1 degree further in that direction. With export capacity to Europe already reduced by more than 80% since 2022, and now with the domestic distribution network under attack, Russia faced a scenario in which its only high-volume commercial outlet for gas and oil was, increasingly, China. And China negotiated like a party that knows exactly that. The discounts on the Brent price, which in 2023 hovered around 15%, had already escalated to close to 30% by 2026. Every additional percentage point of discount represented hundreds of millions of dollars per year, transferred from the Russian treasury to Beijing's coffers. The war Putin launched to restore Russian imperial greatness was, attack after attack, transforming Russia into China's private gas station at a progressively steeper discount. And the greatest paradox of the entire crisis lay precisely here. The weapon the regime had unleashed to wound the enemy was, at that very moment, destroying its own source of income. The war had cost Russia not only 700,000 casualties among the dead and wounded, a figure corresponding to the entire population of cities like Stuttgart or Marseille, erased from the list of combatants in under 3 years, but also the accelerated loss of its energy autonomy, its credibility as an arms exporter, and its negotiating position before the only economic ally it had left. Solnechnogorsk was not just a burning station, it was the entire map on fire. What the fire at Solnechnogorsk established was not simply that Ukraine could strike the heart of Russia's distribution system, that was already known. It established that the cost of protecting every node in that system against cheap drones was greater than the cost of attacking it, and that this equation has no military solution within the resources Moscow can mobilize while sustaining a war of attrition along 1,200 kilometers of front line. The question that no analyst in Washington, Beijing, or Brussels was answering with sufficient clarity was this: at exactly what point does the cumulative degradation of distribution infrastructure transform a logistical problem into a domestic supply crisis capable of generating political instability within Moscow itself? And what does Putin do when the war finally arrives in the gas bill of 21 million Muscovites? The flames of Solnechnogorsk have already gone out. The question they ignited has not. If this analysis helped you see what the fire was really burning, share it with those who follow the conflict and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter, because the answer to that question is going to redraw the energy map of Europe.